In this video, we'll start our exploration of shadows in the Unity editor. We'll start by looking at the mesh render attributes for objects, determining if they cast shadows, receive shadows, or do neither. I've got my main scene for my Zombie Toys game project open, and I'll select the stool object here as part of the environment. What we can see is that the mesh renderer, which actually controls how this mesh shows up in the scene, has cast shadows on and receive shadows on, which means that if we have a light that is casting shadows, it will cast shadows. And also, if objects are casting shadows onto it, they'll show up. The options we have under here are fairly straightforward: on, off, two-sided, and shadows only. To really see this, I'll turn on shadows for my directional light. I'll pick my directional light, which is right now aiming across the room, and under shadow type, I'll change from no shadows to soft shadows. It takes a second, and now we can see shadows across the room from that light. Later, we'll configure this light to look more like a window projecting moonlight into the scene, but for the moment, I'm going to leave it alone. Just simply turning on shadows is enough. I'll go back and reselect the stool, press F to frame in on that selection, and orbit around using Alt and the left mouse button to get a good, clear view of this stool and its shadow. Now with the stool selected, I'll drop down under Cast Shadows and turn it to Off. Now what we see is that this stool cannot cast shadows. Although all the other objects are casting shadows from the light, and the light is enabled to cast shadows, this stool simply will not. This is highly useful in optimizing a scene. There are some things that simply don't need to cast shadows. Either they're too flat or too small, for example. I'll turn this back on. Instead of choosing just on, choosing two-sided. We don't see an immediate difference at the moment. What we'll use two-sided for, though, are planar objects, where we have an object that's one polygon thick, for example, and we need a shadow from both sides. Alternately, we can choose shadows only. What we see then is that this stool disappears, that it's simply there to cast a shadow, and when we deselect it, that's all that remains. The actual mesh is not rendering. I'll reselect it and change my shadows back to on, so we get both the stool visible and its shadow. The second choice we have then, under Cast Shadows, is to receive shadows. This is simply a checkbox. Yes or no, is it receiving shadows or not? And for this, I'll go look at a different object. I've zoomed out in my scene, and I'm going to make the floor temporarily not receive any shadows. I'll select the environment again, and then pick the floor object. In the floor, I'll uncheck Receive Shadows. All the shadows of the objects on the floor then disappear, as the floor is not receiving any shadow. It simply is not able to. Objects such as the drawers in the house, though, are clearly casting shadows on the walls, which are a different mesh and still are receiving shadows. Again, we'll uncheck Receive Shadows for objects that don't need shadows on them. Perhaps they emit light, such as a light bulb or lit sign, and don't need shadows cast on them. Or they're fine detail that is simply obscured in ambient occlusion or darkness and doesn't need to show an actual shadow on it. I'll turn this back on, and we can see the shadows once more appear on the floor. Most of the objects in the scene, then, can both cast and receive shadows. This is a good way to optimize, though, and so I'll look for any objects that can be turned off, either casting or receiving. The stars on the wall are a good example of this. I'll pick one of the wall stars. We can see right now that it is casting and receiving shadows. It's also got an emissive material on it, meaning that they glow softly green. We can see this especially on the dark wall in front. I'll select my wall stars, picking one, holding Shift, and picking the last one, and then I'll turn off their shadow casting properties. I'll drop down with all of them selected and change from on to off. We don't actually see a difference in the scene, as the stars are flat on the wall, and their shadows would be so small that they're almost non-existent in this view. Additionally, I'm going to turn off Receive Shadows for these stars. The stars are emissive, meaning they look like they're glowing softly, and so we don't want any shadows to fall across them necessarily. Here's how this looks. Unchecking Receive Shadows, and we don't see much of a difference. This is due to that emissive material, our wall star material, which has an emission on it. They simply need to be nice and bright in the scene. And so now I've economized this scene slightly by turning off casting and receiving shadows from the stars. These are now 20 objects in here that simply don't participate in shadows and lighten the computational load.